A'udhu min shaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammadin. Kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammadin. Kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Ya ibadallah wa nafsi ittaqullah. Huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Assalamu alaikum. All praises are due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of all creation. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send his salat, his salam, prayers and peace upon our master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the final messenger to mankind, the mercy to all creation, the beloved of Allah. Everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a beginning. Everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a creation. So we say everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came into existence after non-existence. Everything we can think of or can't think of other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came into existence after non-existence. What are we talking about? The throne. The throne, any creature, it came into existence after non-existence. And Allah exists as He always existed. There's no change. The bringing about any creation didn't cause any change to Allah. Change is the most significant sign of a thing, that thing is a creation. And change, it will be an imperfection for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Change for us is something that we accept as servants of Allah, but change doesn't apply to Allah. So Allah did not change when He created creation. He exists as He always exists. There was no time, no space. Those things were created. Those things came into being by the permission, by the creation of Allah, after being non-existence. Time, space, place, direction, those things didn't exist. Allah existed alone. And that is the belief of the vast majority of the Muslims, known as Al-Sunni wal Jama'ah, that Allah exists without a place, without direction. And there is a consensus, meaning an agreement of the scholars of the best of generations, that was reported and recorded in books, by scholars that came after him, that Allah exists without a place, without a direction. That is important fundamental belief that has been preserved and passed down to us generation after generation, and written on by many scholars and talked about and discussed in detail, as the best deed that we can do is the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger. The best deed is the belief. Everything starts with belief. That is our foundation. So I'll bear witness that Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam has spoken the truth and conveyed all that he was ordered to convey. As is reported that he said the first thing that he taught the companions was the belief in Allah, the proper belief in Allah, even before he taught them the Quran. So we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our salat and salam upon the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that it be a means of us connecting to him. It be a means of us be drawing closer to each other. It be a means of us purifying our hearts. We are still in the final few days of the month of Rabi al-Awwal. And this is, where we, like Brother Rashid mentioned last week, you find a lot of gatherings of celebrating the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you see a lot more Muslims becoming more knowledgeable about that, and not just listen to hearsay about it, and actually experiencing it, and seeing the benefit of it, and seeing, that it's only a means, that's for people to come together and worship Allah and connect to the Prophet ﷺ. But this is also a month where people study the life of the Prophet ﷺ, as there are many vast different seer books on his life, books on his special characteristics, many books, scholarly books, and people teach. They read these books, they study with teachers, It's a good time to share with our families about the Prophet ﷺ, because as we will discuss, his connection, our connection to him is very vital for our Islam. So I want to say that I am honored to be amongst you as a member of the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, the best of Ummahs, and the generation, that he was of. He came to a people who were despised in the land, an insignificant people. The Arabs were not an important people in the land. They were not looked at as anything special. You had the superpowers of the land and in the earth in general. As far as you had the Persians, you had the Romans. The Arabs were nothing like that. They were a small, despised people. People seen as backwards, nothing significant, nothing to worry about. He came to those people who were burying their daughters alive, doing all types of things in their ignorance. And by the mercy of Allah, by the power of Allah, by the special merits given to the Prophet ﷺ, by the special barakah given to the Prophet ﷺ, those people became the best of all people. The best of all people, the best generation raised up in mankind. That through their connection, their special connection with the Prophet ﷺ, through their close following him. And that involved turning away from so many things. That Sahaba, it is said that they abstained from 9/10 of the permissible things, the vast majority of permissible things, in order not to fall into the unlawful things. That's what's called water, cautious awareness. Staying away from things to protect their mind, things that were lawful. But it said they did that. If they wouldn't have that methodology, that approach, that they would have fell in ruin in their times. Whereas in our time, it's opposite. By doing a small amount of the sunnah, we can be saved because of the difference of the times. But in their time, they had to stay away from so many sweet, good things of this life in order to not fall into haram and fall into ruin, And by doing that, they were blessed in their connection with the Prophet ﷺ to carry on after his death. As he had said in the hadith, that he said, my life is good for you and my death is good for you. He didn't just say that his life was good for us. He said his death was also good for us. Good for them, which is good for us, That his death was also good. And so many things that they benefit, like I said, from being people with no honor, people with low morals, to becoming the best of people. That by when a time when alcohol, for example, was finally prohibited, when it was finally clearly prohibited, that the streets of Medina were said to fill with wine, And these were people who were big drinkers, big drinkers. But when the call was for them to give it up, they gave it up. Not just like many of our people who are in a weak condition, not in a condition of authority, not in a position of power, in a position where they just scrape up some change to go to the corner store that they don't own, that somebody else owns in their community, to be able to get something. Where they hurting their finances, they going home to a place where they don't own, in a community they don't run, and they're looking for some relief. They got other issues going on, never been getting fair treatment. But you're not talking about that. You're talking about the people who were the authorities in the land, and people who had access to as much alcohol as they can get. It was so much easier for them. They didn't have to scrape up their last change to get it. But When they had the call, they gave it up, you mean. So that was a big thing, you mean. A big thing. Because they were anything you could devices, you can think of devices. You can think of devices for our people, you mean, who sometimes we overlook. The people that the Prophet ﷺ was sent to were much worse. You mean, were much worse because they had authority. They had authority in the land. You mean, it was not under an oppression by another group, you know, like our people are, you know, when we think of some of the things that we do not like to deal with from our people, you know, oh, look at this drunk fool, look at this fool, look at this, you know what I mean? These people who of ours who we have never gotten freedom in the country that we have built, you know. We think about our inability sometimes to be patient with our own people, you know, who are people who didn't come here voluntarily, you know, were brought here chained, shackled on ships. Many died, you know, separated from families, mother separated from child, you know what I mean, so separately, you know, and all that we endured after that. You think about how much we have been through, and still as we find ourselves, you know, if we're honest with ourselves, we find ourselves challenged, you know, with being patient with ourselves, be patient with others who are struggling, who look like us, you know. Right. At one point, Islam wasn't always in our families, you know. We didn't always have the connection that we have to the Prophet ﷺ. But if we look at his life, we look at the seerah, we look at different books talking about different scholarly explanations about certain things, we will see how patient he was with a people that was much worse, much more oppressive in a position, because we're not truly in a position to be oppressive as a body. I mean, we can individually oppress ourselves, but we are people who are at the bottom of the totem pole, you know, the people that are still oppressed. But he took those people, you know, who were much worse than what we see, and he was so patient with them. So patient with them. That's because he was the mercy. He was truly the mercy of all creation. And we can never even imagine, the level that he had, you know what I mean? Certain realities about the Prophet ﷺ, we just accept, you know. That's what's one thing that's been emphasized in one of the classes that we had this month as we're studying one of the books by one of the scholars, one of the great scholars of our time. It's called Muhammad, the Perfect Man, and it was authored by a scholar of our times who was a descendant of the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, Al-Hassan. And in approaching that book, you know, our particular teacher emphasized to us not to approach the Prophet ﷺ as a denier, you know what I mean? Just because things might be beyond our scope, beyond our understanding, not to approach him as a denier. As much what we don't know is much more than what we know, and that will always be the case, you mean? Those who learn and reach higher levels of knowledge, they realize that, the more they learn, the more they realize they didn't know. The more they learn, the less they claimed, you know what I mean? Or the opposite of us, you mean? You know, we claim so much, though we know so little. But we were told not to approach it as a denier. So that it's just realities of the Prophet. So the reality of the Prophet, some realities of his characteristics, that we cannot perceive. But Allah has favored him abundantly for us to be here today. Is his secrets to that, It's special bounties that were given to the Prophet ﷺ, that those who tapped in, we have to have our chance to tap in. The Prophet ﷺ was someone who empowered. If we look historically, he empowered black people. A lot of people will speak to us about the Prophet ﷺ, and anybody speaking about the Prophet ﷺ usually is such, the connection that Allah has made for us. Is such, that it can have an effect on us. It's so special. But the Prophet ﷺ spoke to black people in a way that he empowered them. When the Nagus, the ruler of Ethiopia, and addressing him. The Prophet ﷺ addressed him in a unique way, knowing what he knew, and he invited this king and his forces to come to Islam. This African ruler, who was the one, who provided the Muslims with a safe place when there was no safe place. There was no safe place for them in their own homeland. There was no safe place in their own homeland. That he provided that first safe place, that first place for Islam to be nurtured. The first nurtured environment was provided in Africa, by this king, And the Prophet ﷺ addressed him different than he addressed other kings. He wrote letters to different rulers, without fear, without worry about them attacking, He didn't have any fear of that. So he wrote letters to the mightiest kings, of Persia and of Rome, and other kings. And it was different responses. And he, Allah made him aware of whatever he made him aware of. But this letter was said to be more than just one letter to this African king, was such in a way that he was inviting him and his forces not to come, okay, you come to Islam and, give up your autonomy, go to the back, go back there, clean something, and he invited him and his forces to come into Islam to maintain his autonomy, So he invited us, because that's the reality of us to be who we are, to still be leaders among ourselves, to still, that's how he did. He didn't invite us to be slaves of anybody else, And right now we're in a position, where black Muslims in this country, everybody still wants us to be their slaves. But that is not the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That is not the connection we made. And we see when those connections were made early on, while the Prophet ﷺ was still alive, So you had Muslims, you had the Nagus who embraced Islam. The Prophet ﷺ offered the funeral prayer from him. And you had Muslims that thrived in these African civilizations, who had the access to what other Muslims had access to. They had access to the knowledge that other Muslims had access to. They had access to the higher level of scholarship, where it is still an effort, and how many of us had this experience where we might go into a mosque, and it might even be now like somebody that looks like us, somebody that's African, but been separated, and they've been through their own colonization where the divide and conquer, is strong. And they might ask you, are you Muslim? In your own country, that you built, built on the backs of our ancestors, are you Muslim? And what do you think about what that's saying, think about what that's saying, somebody saying that, you can see how it gives them a reason to consider you not worthy of even leading yourself, because you don't even know if you're Muslim, not worthy of getting access to the best of what you can get of Islam, the connection of Prophet ﷺ, because I don't even know if you're Muslim, it gives me an excuse, not to at least be indifferent to your suffering and your pain, to your needs, because every community has specific needs. Our community has specific needs. That's why we have to have leaders always amongst ourselves, But we also don't want to be restricted from having all the tools, But when you're seen as insignificant, when you're seen as, I don't even know if you're Muslim, somebody just has an excuse not to give it to you. And you have others who are more bold and more outright, hostile and uncaring, where they know, they accept that you're Muslim, they're going to tell you, you're not fit to lead yourselves, So you have communities, now, and then you see polls out where it's the decline of black Muslims in mosques, and you have to think of you don't have a nurturing environment when you come into Islam, and you thrown into an environment where you don't recognize any honor and the people that you see that are Muslims, because there's many places we don't have our own masjids anymore, like we used to have our own communities, connected communities. It's not that you thrown in there, you're not Muslim. The people who just came and just for a better life, and they got stores in your community, you're not putting money back in the community, they can send it back overseas, but they can't invest in the community. You mean that they made their money off of you, people that look like you, who sometimes we look down upon. It's not the environment for us to thrive. It's not it'll never be the environment for us to thrive under somebody else's leadership. But that's the way the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, we look at his life, he always empowered people to go back and teach their own people, to lead their own people. Different people will come and say, okay, you teach them now, go back and teach your people. He didn't say, okay, now go be a slave to this person, and totally follow this one person who don't know you, and put all your hopes and give all your money and depend on him. No, that's not nurturing environment for us. Nobody's going to understand our specific needs, but people that are amongst us, that they understand our experience. That's how it is. You don't separate that when you teach people, and that's the Prophet ﷺ. That's what made him special. That he empowered everybody that he approached. He empowered everybody that he dealt with. That's why he was fit for the role that he had. He took people who were nothing and gave them the honor. That's all our honor comes from Islam. So we'll talk some more briefly in the second part. Alhamdulillah, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alayhi wa sahbihi wa salam. Ya ibadallah wa nafsi taqullah. And I remind myself and you all to have the taqwa of Allah. And that is what those companions had. That's what those who followed them, they had the taqwa of Allah, where they were willing to give up their desires to avoid the displeasure of Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ, when we look at his life, we study his life, we see that he gave up so much of the dunya, where he ate little, and sometimes will be months without any fire in the house for cooking, And he had offers of so much, where they, at one time, that the Arabs wanted the exchange for to shut him up, just to give him, so much, but he was a servant prophet. He chose to be a servant prophet. So he stayed close to the people so much, that he didn't. Somebody can come in to a gathering, and sit next to him. And they have no special permission. Young and the old, can sit next to him. But he ate little. He slept little, where he prayed at night till his ankles swelled, not because he was in trouble, but out of gratitude for what he had. So he had a great concern for us, and part of that gratitude was, his connection to us, his love for us, his concern for us. He prayed for his ummah constantly. So that means he prayed for us. And his speaking was little. He spoke when it was necessary, when it was pleasing. He avoided much useless talk. So he had an attachment to Allah and not an attachment to this world. We have to and connected to him, we have to find ways to detach from this world. The more we connect to him, the more we will not be so tied to this world. As I said, that we keep the dunya, the world, in our hands, not in our hearts. That we use the world for our benefit, but our hearts are for the worship of Allah, and we do that by connecting to the Prophet ﷺ. As there is no connection to Allah without the connection to the Prophet ﷺ. And that in itself should be humbling for us. So, and I was thinking about this kids movie, and it's like a Netflix movie. It's called like We Can Be Heroes, and these young kids, they see their parents. Their parents are in the movie trapped away. They don't know what's the reality, what's going on, and these kids, they have to figure out how to get their parents out by themselves and work together, use their different superpowers that they have from being the children of superpowers and superheroes, and they use their strengths to get their parents out, and I was thinking, this they have their fantasies and stuff, in this country, but we have our own potential for our own, in a sense, superheroes from amongst us, and not to look for those outside, to save us, And they failed us and continue to fail us again and again, And say one of the definitions of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again, We keep looking for those outside of us to save us, and it only makes us more slave, only makes us more weak. And we know our situation is a dire situation as far as these next generations coming up, And they are in need of we are in need of producing our own, in a sense, superheroes, And that's by, taking the best approaches to gain from our deen, from our connection, and improve our connection to Prophet Sallallahu as best as we can, so we can give our kids something where they can be the upcoming generations, where they can be superheroes amongst the, superheroes in deen, so we can preserve our own identity, preserve our own Islam within our communities, Because if you talk to these different leaders who are aware of everything on the ground, in different cities throughout the country, that things are only getting worse, It's only, more despair, Is many who are not a part of any community, don't feel anything in Islam. Our youth, are being attacked by so much, going out of Islam, atheism, that's one of the big things in this country. And our youth are falling into all that, And they don't see enough examples in us, They don't see enough examples in us, They don't see the Islam that we want them to have, But it's not too late for us to right the ship, To have, to, like that, how that movie was, so they can see what's really inside them, what they really can do, the potential that they really have. Is not too late to give them that, because the upcoming generations are going to need to be better than us, and that's what happened in that movie, where they at the end said the next generation has to go further or be better than the previous one. And we know that's needed for us if we are honest, And many are fighting the good fight, and a lot of people can only fight so much before they get tired. It's time for younger generations to step up, And just there's only so much that people can do. That's why we collectively, the Sahaba, by connecting to Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam individually and teaching their families, they connected collectively to strengthen each other, And that's what's needed, for us to strengthen each other, So while these last few days of this month of Rabi'ah is important for us to take advantage, look at the life of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Examine something that we didn't before, and every time we look at the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, it should be something, that we didn't realize before, or that we didn't learn before, or something that we might have learned but will impact us differently this time. And just by strengthening our connection should be enough to keep us going, to keep us motivated, Because We're gonna have times where we're gonna be down. We're not gonna be up all every day. But just by that connection, and knowing that it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and knowing it's special favor, that it's knowing it's unique. All of us have a unique connection to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All of us have a unique connection, and it's needed, for us to tap into that, and pull together so that we can right the ship, But that connection to us should be enough to keep us going, to keep us motivated until we can get to the next stage, because, some days we're going to be limping along the way, Some days we're almost going to seem like we're going to be crawling along the way, but we're still moving, we're still going. And then we never know when that mercy of Allah will come, when we strengthen for the task that's needed, It's not one person that can afford to be sit down. It's not one person that can afford to take a seat. Everybody is needed. We're not qualified, but it's necessary for us to do the work. We're doing what we got to do by necessity. So it's all our hands on deck. So it's not an excuse for somebody to say they're not qualified, because in a war like this, it's necessary for everybody to play their part. Like somebody who you had a situation where you emergency situation in a battle. It don't matter if somebody even shot a gun before; they got to go out there and do it. So we in the battle for our souls. In the spiritual battle, we got to go out there. Inexperienced or not, and do our part. And as we going along, we learn. And I know before I close, those in some of my Islamic classes, 30, 40 years in their 70s and stuff, and they might have relearned what they were taught over and over again, but it's inspiring me because they haven't gotten down like this is too much. No, they're going, relearning. I look at some of my like notes of my mother, like, wow, she's more serious student than me. Look at her, she got the notes in the book on the side, and she got the organized notes and all that. 70-something years old, like you feel like she be tired, but she's going, like, okay, what can I learn? What can I learn, even in the basic things, not to be humble. And that's a real humility thing. You think, okay, I'll master the basics, but we haven't even mastered the basics, And a lot of that is not solely our fault, where we have been taught in a way where others wanted us to be their slaves, where they restricted us access, to certain things. But now, as we are learning, so it's an amazing thing to see, to see some of our elders where they're not too proud to relearn what they thought they learned. So we can't be like that too. We have to continue to learn the best as we can. And inshallah, that's part of that connection to the Prophet or something. A major part, the major part, because we can't build except off the basics, and he taught the basics first, and the Sahabas itself by putting the basics in practice first. So may Allah allow us to do that. May Allah guide us. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والأحياء منهم والأموات. May Allah guide us, forgive us, and allow us to truly connect to Him through His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and be fighters in His work for our people until we die. Amen. Alhamdulillah.